The Dark Scrolls. Let's get one thing straight. If Hollywood taught history, William Wallace would have died with a six-pack, screaming, "Freedom!" in slow motion while bagpipes sobbed in the background and Mel Gibson's blue face glistened in high-definition tragedy. But this, my friend, is not a movie. This is medieval Britain, and they did things with a bit less subtlety and a lot more entrails. Wallace was born sometime in the late 13th century in Scotland, probably to a minor noble family, which meant he was slightly better off than a peasant but not quite ready to sit next to the king at dinner. He wasn't supposed to be the poster boy for Scottish rebellion. But fate, along with some excellent sword skills and a fiery distaste for English occupation, had other plans. By 1207, Wallace had staged a rebellion, hacked up an English garrison or two, and become the kind of local legend bards sang about and tax collectors quietly resented. Then came the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Wallace, with a ragtag army of spearmen, peasants, and probably more than a few angry shepherds, managed to absolutely humiliate the English. It was one of those moments where history hiccups and the underdog bites the ankle of the empire. He was crowned Guardian of Scotland, a kind of freelance head of state for a country that barely had a functioning government and lots of plaid. But good things never last, especially when the other side has more swords, ships, and a king nicknamed Longshanks. Edward Y of England. The man had a long nose, a longer temper, and a vendetta for anyone who dared threaten his claim over Scotland. He was not a man to take rebellion lightly. In fact, he had a particular fondness for crushing uprisings with such theatrical brutality. It's a wonder the Tower of London didn't come with a front-row ticket booth. Wallace's honeymoon with power ended at the Battle of Falkirk in 1298, where he was outmaneuvered, outnumbered, and outhorsed. The defeat forced him into hiding, reduced his rebel army to glorified banditry, and turned him from guardian to ghost. For years, he wandered the countryside like a medieval Che Guevara, bearded, brooding, and hunted. Eventually, as these stories go, betrayal showed up dressed in a Scottish nobleman's cloak. Enter John de Menteith, a man whose loyalty could be purchased with the right kind of gold, and a wink from Edward's diplomats. In August 1305, Menteith handed Wallace over to the English in Glasgow. Wallace, probably exhausted and half expecting it, didn't resist much. His capture wasn't the stuff of legend. It was quiet, efficient, and deeply disappointing for any watching squirrels. Now, let's talk about what happens when you get caught rebelling against a king like Edward. Spoiler: they don't just slap your wrist and tell you to pay your taxes on time. Wallace was dragged, quite literally, to London. Not flown, not carted in luxury. Dragged. From Scotland. That's several hundred miles of dirt roads, rain, and jeering crowds. And it wasn't a discreet affair either. No. Edward wanted everyone and their grandmother to know exactly who had been caught and exactly what was coming. Think of it like a royal press tour, but the star was in chains and hadn't eaten a hot meal in weeks. By the time Wallace reached the Tower of London, he was emaciated, shackled, and no doubt mentally preparing for something awful. He wasn't wrong. He stood trial in Westminster Hall, the medieval version of a kangaroo court, complete with nobles who hated him and clerks who had already written the verdict before he opened his mouth. The charge? Treason. The defense? Wallace claimed he couldn't betray a king he never swore allegiance to. Logical, but unfortunately logic didn't stand a chance against royal rage. The sentence had already been decided. Death by a method so grotesque it sounds like it was dreamed up by a bored demon. Hanged, drawn, and quartered. It sounds quaint now, almost poetic. But make no mistake, it was England's way of saying, not only are you going to die, but we're going to invent new verbs just to make it worse. On August 23rd, 1305, London woke up early. Wallace was tied to a wooden hurdle and dragged through the streets like a parade float for vengeance. Naked, filthy, bleeding, the crowds lined the route, jeering, throwing garbage, probably trying to pickpocket each other in the chaos. He was hauled through Smithfield, where public executions were performed with the kind of civic pride usually reserved for football matches. Children laughed. Vendors sold meat pies. Humanity's dark humor was alive and well. And then the real fun began. He was hanged, yes, but only until nearly dead. Can't have your prisoner dying before the main event. That would ruin the show, so they let him dangle just long enough for the black spots to bloom in his eyes before cutting him down, wheezing and twitching. Next came the drawing, a word that here means we're about to turn your insides into outside daycare. They castrated him. That's right. Cut off the bits. Then, without any anesthetic or mercy, they slit him open and pulled out his intestines. And just to really drive the message home, they threw his entrails into a fire while he watched. At this point, most people would be mercifully unconscious, but Wallace, that iron-willed Scotsman, may have been very much aware. Some accounts claim he didn't scream, others say he roared like a lion. Either way, the crowd loved it. Still not done. His heart was cut out, yes, after the other organs, and possibly still beating when they held it up. A fine little punctuation mark on a performance in state-sponsored butchery. Finally, his head was hacked off, his body quartered into 4 meaty reminders of what happens when you poke the English crown with a claymore. And those pieces? They were sent to different cities, Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, like grim postcards. The head, dipped in tar and stuck on a pike above London Bridge, smiling forever into the smog. Not quite what Braveheart promised, is it? By the time William Wallace's head was secured, still glistening with tar and civic satisfaction, above the fog-draped silhouette of London Bridge, King Edward I must have felt pretty pleased with himself. Nothing says mission accomplished, quite like scattering a man's limbs across the kingdom like medieval confetti. After all, Wallace wasn't just executed, he was strategically dismantled and turned into a 4-part cautionary tale. Let's pause for a second and admire the logistics. 1/4 of Wallace went to Newcastle, probably with an apologetic note to the local lord. Dear sir, please hang this body part in a prominent place. Regards, the Crown. Another chunk ended up in Berwick, a town that had ping-ponged between English and Scottish hands more times than a cursed tennis ball. Stirling, where Wallace had once humiliated an entire English army, got a piece too, call it poetic irony. And finally, Perth, whose reward for being politically lukewarm was the gruesome gift of a legendary shin, or maybe a forearm. This was public relations, Edward style. You didn't just kill your enemies, you distributed them. And what about Wallace's head? Well, that remained the jewel of the collection. It was tarred. For longevity, medieval preservation methods were surprisingly crafty, and mounted atop a spike on London Bridge, where every merchant, traveler, and child on a field trip could admire the grisly result of high treason. The head became less a warning and more of a roadside attraction. Some folks even claimed it grinned. Others said it rotted with an expression of defiance. Either way, pigeons loved it. Now you might think that the story ends there, with Wallace's body reduced to souvenirs. But no, the execution was only the start of his afterlife as a legend. In trying to destroy him, Edward had accidentally done the opposite. He made him immortal. See, when you carve a man up and nail him to half the kingdom, it tends to make people talk. And when those people are Scottish, stubborn, and very good at telling stories, well, that's how myths are born. In taverns from Ayr to Aberdeen, the tale of Wallace grew more muscular with each telling. He fought off 100 Englishmen single-handedly. He once chopped a sheriff clean in half. He could kill a man just by shouting. Never mind that some of it was exaggeration, all of it was belief. His execution, meant to end him, had backfired into legend. The English had created a martyr with excellent PR. Meanwhile, back in England, Edward Wallace, the self-proclaimed Hammer of the Scots, was busy congratulating himself on being the undisputed master of the British Isles. One problem: the Scots didn't seem to know they'd been conquered. Wallace was gone, but the flame he lit wasn't. Because guess who showed up not long after Wallace's death? Robert the Bruce. Yes, that Robert, the man with a name so blunt it sounds like a lumberjack. He was another noble who, like everyone else in medieval politics, had danced between alliances like a nervous actor auditioning for both sides. But eventually, Bruce had enough of Edward's heavy hand, and Wallace's fate gave him all the motivation he needed. Now, here's where it gets spicy. Bruce didn't just continue Wallace's war. He did it bigger, bloodier, and with better strategy. If Wallace was the fire starter, Bruce was the slow, smoldering blaze that burned all the way to Bannockburn. A battle in 1314 that saw the English humiliated by a smaller, smarter Scottish army. Honestly, it was starting to feel personal. Edward Fye didn't live to see it. He died in 1307, just 2 years after Wallace's grand finale. Some say he wanted to be buried upright so he could keep marching on Scotland. If that sounds like the kind of thing a villain in a fantasy series would say, it's because it is. He even ordered his bones to be carried into battle should the Scots rise again. Talk about commitment. But bones don't win wars. People do. And the people had been inspired by Wallace, not because he had a flawless political agenda or a great haircut, but because he stood up when everyone else bent over. His execution, obscene and over the top, gave the Scots a common enemy, a banner, and a shared trauma to rage against. Back in Scotland, secret songs were sung about him. Priests whispered blessings in his name. Children were raised on tales of the giant who roared, "Freedom!" with his last breath, which again probably didn't happen, but who's counting? Wallace became part man, part myth, and entirely unkillable, thanks ironically to the very people who tried hardest to erase him. Meanwhile, in London, that rotting head slowly withered. Maybe it was knocked off by a storm. Maybe a particularly determined raven flew off with part of his cheek. No one knows exactly when the head disappeared, but by then, it didn't matter. William Wallace was everywhere, even if his pieces were not. His story would outlast kings, borders, and later, Mel Gibson's Australian accent. But let's not skip ahead too far. Because the final chapter of Wallace's saga isn't about his life or even his death. It's about what happened after the myth took root. The power of legacy, the poetry of rebellion, and the lasting sting of a man who refused to be forgotten. By now, William Wallace was dead. Disassembled, char-grilled, sent by royal mail to 4 corners of the kingdom. A man could hardly be more dead, really. And yet, somehow, he was just getting started, because while the English crown celebrated a textbook case of how to kill a rebellion in 5 grisly steps, Scotland was brewing something altogether more inconvenient: a national identity. And as history loves to prove, few things are harder to murder than an idea whose time has come, especially when that idea is wearing chainmail and shouting freedom between verses of a folk ballad. Let's rewind to the streets of Edinburgh and the smoky corners of rural inns. The bards, those medieval mixtape artists, had plenty to work with. They didn't see Wallace as a man brutally executed. They saw a Christ-like figure, chopped down for his convictions, and now looming over the land like a patriotic ghost with boundary issues. In truth, Wallace was never a saint. He didn't float. He didn't turn wine into whiskey. He likely killed more men than scurvy. But history, as we know, isn't written by the dead. It's written by those still standing with a quill, a grudge, and a flair for drama. Soon, tales of Wallace grew taller than castle towers. He became 10 feet tall in song, capable of cleaving enemies in two with a single swing and leaping across moats with a smirk. His infamous sword, now believed to be over 5 feet long, was said to glow in the presence of tyranny, though that may have been just rust and moonlight. What mattered was this: Wallace wasn't gone. He was evolving into a legend, a symbol, a walking grievance in every Scotsman's heart. By the time Robert the Bruce declared himself king, Wallace's myth had matured into national gospel. Bruce, who had once fought against Wallace, then for him, then for himself — politics is messy — knew the value of martyrdom. And so he did what any smart leader would do. He borrowed it. When Bruce defeated the English at Bannockburn in 1314, he wasn't just swinging a sword. He was swinging history. The English army was crushed. Edward II, son of Longshanks and nowhere near as terrifying, fled the field with all the grace of a drunk nobleman chasing his wig in the wind. Scotland hadn't just won a battle, it had roared back to life. And in every tavern afterward, the refrain was the same: Wallace would be proud. That's how it goes with martyrs. They become templates, tools, wallpaper for revolutions. But time is a trickster. Fast forward a few centuries, and Wallace's legacy would undergo an even stranger twist. He became a brand. In the 18th and 19th centuries, long after kilts were banned and bagpipes were considered acts of rebellion, Scottish romanticism bloomed like thistles in a field of empire. Poets, novelists, and historians dusted off Wallace's name and gave him a makeover. No longer just a warrior, he was now a man of noble resistance, a defender of liberty, a Celtic Prometheus. You could almost forget he'd once gutted English garrisons like a man trying to open a can with a hammer. And then came Hollywood. Ah, yes, Braveheart. The cinematic fever dream that launched 1,000 face paint selfies and at least one Mel Gibson Oscar. The film was equal parts battle cry and history crime. Did Wallace wear a kilt? No, but in the movie, he twirled in one like it was runway couture. Did he sleep with the French princess? Also no, unless necromancy was involved. But none of that mattered. For millions, that movie was Wallace. He had gone global. Suddenly, tourists were flocking to Stirling and paying to see a statue that looked more like Mel Gibson than a medieval warrior. Wallace merchandise popped up: mugs, magnets, action figures. Somewhere, a man who'd once been drawn and quartered was now featured on keychains. But maybe that's the point. William Wallace never wanted to be a saint or a celebrity. He wanted Scotland to be free, or at least to stop being the king's chew toy. And while the path to that goal was soaked in blood and guts, mostly his, he lit a fire that never quite went out. The real Wallace was flawed, violent, reckless, brave. He wasn't carved from marble, but from stubbornness, rage, and the bone-deep knowledge that some things are worth fighting for, even if you end up barbecued on a cart in London. His death was supposed to end the dream. Instead, it fertilized it. So now, centuries later, when you walk across London Bridge, remember, somewhere under the concrete and buses, Wallace's tarred skull once stared back at an empire. And somewhere in the hills of Scotland, someone is still whispering his name over a pint of something strong. Not bad for a guy who lost the war, died 1,000 deaths, and still won immortality. The execution was horrifying. The legacy, unkillable. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.